Okay. Are you ready
Okay.
for me?
I'm gonna make, how much time do we have? We have like 5 minutes? Oh, go ahead.
No, I
Go
was
ahead, are you
saying,
ready?
are you ready for me to admit people so we can get started?
I'm fine.
I'm all set, I'm ready.
Okay, can you advance that one slide just to make sure that it goes to the next slide? Perfect, okay. All right, go back. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna start admitting people. Should have played a little Star Wars music, May the Force be with you. Okay. Okay.
Great. About how many people do we have, Bar?
We have 20 in here now.
Oh, great.
So we were supposed to start at 10:55. So if you want to, I don't know if you want to wait a little bit or you want to start.
I can go. Shall I start, Dave?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, guys. Welcome, everyone, virtually. I wish we were sitting across from each other. Dave and I are here to present the Delivering a Successful Construction Project. I'm going to introduce myself and have Dave introduce himself, and then I'm going to do a quick review of our goals and the agenda, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dave to start on the slides. Again, my name is Leslie Lucas. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Athenian School. I've been here a little over 5 years, and for the first, I'd say, 3 years, I was completely all consumed by my big, large construction project. So it's a $24 million construction project, half funded by pledges. We built about 30,000 new square feet, and it was a dining hall, classrooms, robotics, innovation studio, and some office space. And so I'm here to share some of the things I've learned from that project. Dave? Did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so Dave Lessing, I'm Dave Lessing. I'm here, and I've been through a number of projects. I've had great experiences, and I've also had some interesting experiences. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And I've also done renovations, new construction, and we're actually working on a playground now that's half done. So I guess it's the COVID playground that we're finishing up. So that's a little bit about me. Great,
great. So again, our goal is to preview sort of from concept to completion what we think what we would advise as the steps to take, and most importantly, to share some lessons learned in each of those components. We're going to start with the key people and the various multitudes of people and vendors who are involved in this process. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the process, and because it really begins well before, obviously, you put a shovel in the ground. Then we're going to talk about some financing and budgets. And on some of there, and some legal, that combined with some legal, attorney review, et cetera, recommendations. And then we're going to save about 15 minutes at the end to answer questions. I mean, I don't mind if, maybe Dave, you can let him know if there's a large question that's pending while we're going through the presentation. I mean, feel free to ask, but we'll certainly save enough time at the end for lots of questions.
Yep, no, that sounds great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the construction project. And so it may be a review for some of you, it may be new for others, but want to make sure we're all grounded on construction project. And so basically, I like to start with who the key players are, as Leslie mentioned. And at the center of all that's the owner or the school. And then the other players, the most important of which is the architect we'll talk about in a minute. and then general contractor, subcontractors who are actually, they work with the owner, but they're also contracted with the general contractor. And then there are other vendors. I think we want to talk about some other players that may be involved depending on the project that you have. Okay, so first, want to talk a little bit about key player, the owner. And so for all of us working at a school, wonderful place to work, you know, there's usually one person, senior leader, typically not the head of school, but someone who is actually, you know, really focused on the project. And I think the one thing here is it's really important for this person to have extra time as you move into a construction project opportunity. I know all of us are very busy, but one of the things is things will come up during the construction project, different phases we'll talk about in a minute. It's really important to have time for that senior leader to quickly resolve some of the issues that come up. Steering teams, I like to say students first. So we were fortunate to have a student steering team on some of our projects, and I found that to be the most helpful, most interesting. Also, of course, boards, school leaders, teachers, staff. The more people you have in the community, the better at different levels. And then finally, the owner's rep. This is a very important role, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but the owner's rep is a key role. And you know, one of the things that we've learned, Leslie and I were talking about this, is making sure that you invest in having the right owner's rep. And so from early on, you have the right person who can help shepherd along the project, participate in very detailed meetings with the contractor, the architects, and others. And then in some cases, you know, having to document key decisions and other information. And again, representing the owner, not having the general contractor or others, you know, documenting that. The next key player is the architect, and typically there's going to be one senior person, principal at the architect, and ideally this is someone who has experience in similar projects, either size or scope. You know, for our school, we've worked with a great architect for about 8 years now, and they have worked on a number of school projects in and around the Bay Area. And so I think it's school projects are different than other projects, and it's important to have the right architect. And then obviously there's others on the who work for the architect that will support them. One of the things that's important, lessons learned, at least for, you know, from my perspective, is from the architect. You know, we've decided to have an architect work with us from beginning to end. And I think that when you do that, and I found that to be a great experience with our architect, but when you do that, you really have to identify the architect and what their, you know, core competency is. And something that for us, our architect knows code and knows schools very well. That was extremely important to us. But there are a number of other things that obviously the architect will do, whether it's design, compliance, product detail, really getting into extreme detail on door handles or whatever it is on your project. It's really important to have the right architect for that. The other thing is when you're investing in the architect, again, I had a project that I worked on probably about 9 or 10 years ago early on, and we had an architect that was, we didn't invest, as our previous architect didn't invest for the best architect. We looked for someone who saved us money, and it ended up costing us money in the long term. So the one thing that I will say is investing in the design process is really important. The next key player, general contractor, and typically there'll be one senior leader. Construction manager is a typical title that you know, would be the person at the general contractor. And then for medium or larger general contractors, they'll have an estimator, an estimating team, and then and that kind of group or person will really show up a lot at the beginning of the project, pre-construction. Anytime you want to do change orders and other things, you know, the estimators will be looking at that in detail. And then the construction team. And this is really important. When you hire a general contractor, you're hiring a team. And oftentimes, like we went through a process, oftentimes you'll have a couple of general contractors that may be great, but it really depends on which team that they have is available at the time. We went through and we looked, we talked to a number of general contractors for a recent project, and we had it narrowed down to 2, and they were both equally good. One of them, the one we chose, ended up having the right team. And that was, so we not only chose the general contractor, we also chose the team at the time that, worked on the project. And that turned out to be, worked out really well for us in that respect. Lessons learned, I will say general contractor, they will talk about your school. They may act like they care about your school. In my opinion, what they're really motivated by is cash and profit. And that's something, it's not a bad thing, but it's something for you just to keep in the back of your mind when you're working with the general contractor. I know for me, when I'm working with them, it's a little bit different, the communications and the way I work with the general contractor than it is when I work with others in the school community. And so it's really important to understand that. The other thing is really understand, it's important to understand your construction contract and then the leverage points that you have at different points in the project. For example, at the end of the project, when you get into punch list, we'll talk about that in a second, that's a phase where you really hold retention dollars, and that the contractor needs to complete punch list, and they need to complete the items to your satisfaction. And when they do so, then you can release retention, and that's something that it's really important to understand your leverage points and take advantage of those at different points in the project. So moving on, subcontractor, this is the one, they do a lot of the work. So a lot of the trades, as I mentioned earlier, they're hired by the general contractor. And it's really important to understand the relationship that the subcontractors have with the general contractor and maybe also with other subs. And sometimes subcontractors will also under them have subs of subcontractors. So it's really important to understand the relationships there. And then when you're early in the project and you're looking at pricing the overall project, I know for us, we had a project, when we looked at it, there were two electrical subcontractors about the same price. One was slightly higher than the other. We actually chose the higher one because of the reputation and because of the quality of their work. And so that's a really important thing to understand. And, understanding, balancing the fiduciary responsibility, kind of like what you see on paper versus sometimes the quality of the work that people deliver, and understanding what it may cost you later to fix things if some of the subs do not deliver quality work. Very, very important to understand. So moving on, other vendors, there are consultants, sometimes hired by either the owner or the architect on specific topics. I know we recently did a 30,000 square foot school building and 3 stories. And for that building, acoustics is really important. And so we had an acoustics engineering firm that worked with, they were contracted by the architect, but they also worked closely with the owner on acoustics, because that was really important. Inside the classroom, what does it sound like with noise inside the classroom, and then also, from floors above and below and classrooms next to each other. Very important. Also, direct partners. There are going to be installers. Sometimes you can save money and get better quality work if you engage the installer directly. For example, for a recent project we did, we installed a whiteboard company directly. And that was something that turned out to be fantastic. They did high quality work, and it's really good. I think overall, when you're looking at these consultants and direct partners, understanding early in the process what you need and the budget that you have is really important, and something that the more you can start early on this. You'll hear this is a constant theme throughout this presentation. Starting early on things will help you in the long run save money and get quality work done. Okay, if we look at the overall construction phases, so that's a little bit of an overview of some of the players. And again, during the Q&A section, we can go into more detail and address any specific questions you have. I think on the key phases, just to kind of overlay, what does a construction project look like? Typically, most projects will start with schematic design. And this is the fun part, when you really start with what are all the ideas, what are the things that you can do. And during this phase, it's important to have enough time to really analyze some of the big scope cost topics. Do you want to have a 2-story building or a 3-story building? Do you want to have 20 classrooms or 25 classrooms? What are the, have smaller classrooms but more of them, or fewer classrooms and larger classrooms? So those are the things that are really important in the schematic design phase. After that, you move into design development, and this is really taking whatever your design is and going, a little bit deeper on that. And this is when it's important to work closely with the architect, and they start to look at building occupancy requirements and some of the other things that are required by the city, the state, the county. And it's important, to work closly, with the architect as they kind of go through the details. They may have some questions, and there's some decisions that are important decisions at that phase, at this point, that will impact construction and the building when it's done. At this point, at the end of design development, this is when typically you'll start to look for a general contractor. And it's important to include the architect in that process. I know for us, we actually work closely with our architect. They sat in the meetings with all the general contractors and to understand, who do they feel comfortable working with? And then have they had any prior working relationships, hopefully good, with some of the general contractors. After that, you have a contractor on board. You moved into construction documents. And this is when the architect really goes extremely deep on looking at the building or whatever your project is in extreme detail through all the different, electrical, all the different trades and to really define that in as much detail as possible. At this point, it's very important to allow some extra time to look at scope and cost trade-offs. And I think that I know for us and like many of you, probably in a rush to get the project done, but it's really important to invest the time here to get it right because after you move out of the construction documents, then you're starting to work on the project. Then you move into pre-construction. At this point, it's really a budgeting exercise, a detailed budgeting exercise. The one thing here, lessons learned, make sure that, and I know you guys know this, but I know for me, I really had to remind myself, to work with the board and other people to make sure you have a realistic budget, and then make sure you have owner contingency. So a little bit of money on the side that is just in case things happen. All the projects I've worked on, they start off great. And then they get into it and things get a little bit like, oh, how are we going to pay for that? Something that even a well thought out project has surprises that come up. Think about what's going on now. I have 2 construction projects going on now that were on hold for a month and a half, something that we didn't anticipate, even 4 months ago. So very important in pre-construction to have a little bit extra owner contingency. Then getting into construction, this is the fun part when you get to see things get done. And for many of you, if you have a project going on on your campus or near your school, it's important to think about, operations and other things. But for the construction project, it's really important, to work with your owner's rep to document, key decisions, meetings, agreements you have. The more you document in writing and it's communicated to everyone, it'll really help you in the long run if you have any questions, concerns, or even disputes that happen later. At the end of construction, you will hopefully get a certificate of occupancy when you can actually, the building is ready for its intended use. And at that point, you move into an important phase where you move out of the construction phase and into the punch list. And this is really one where you work with your architect to resolve some of the issues that may come up. And I say patience here because I know when you have an active school and you have a building, everyone's excited for it. You still have these little nagging issues that need to get done. You want to give the architect and the contractor time to complete those, in a quality manner, so it doesn't hurt you in the long run. So I think that that's a little bit of an overview of the construction, different phases. Through this whole project, it's important to have engage an excellent construction attorney. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have a really solid attorney. We've been fortunate. We've had an attorney, and usually what you'll do is you'll work with the attorney at the beginning before the schematic design phase. And the attorney will help you, construction attorney will help you with a contract with the architect, and then also on the with the general contractor. And AIA, which is kind of a standard contract template that's used in this industry, is what you'll probably most likely be using. And when you do that, there are different types of contracts, and there are lots of different business terms. Again, your construction attorney can help you with that, and really, it's a very good, tool, a very good person to have, on your team. Near the end of the construction project, substantial completion, that's a key milestone. That's actually when you get later into the project, when you're complete, the substantial completion, AIA G704, that's an important document that will drive anything that happens after the project is done and any disputes that you have. So it's really important. I'll say one thing on liens and lawsuits. They happen, and they're common, I would say, in the construction industry. Unfortunately, even though we've done a lot of really good work, we've had a couple of liens placed against us, and it happens. And the important thing is to make sure that you signal to your head of school, to the board, to others when it happens, and to be on top of it. Also with your bank, the lender, all of those. But it's not something you should worry too much about. Work with your construction attorney. I had a situation, for example, where there was a subcontractor who worked on a previous project, was having a divorce, going through a divorce. It was a messy divorce. And as a result of that, they got into lawsuits, and then that subcontractor filed liens against everyone he had worked with in the past. And so, including us. And we were surprised. We're like, what is this? So it happens. Don't worry about it. No problem. So that's a little quick overview of, people, the projects, and legal. And now I'm going to turn it over to Leslie to talk a little bit about the fun stuff, financing.
Thanks, Dave. It's great. So I wanted to go through financing and budget. I think the most common ways to finance a construction project, at least in the private school world, is really a combination of debt and fundraising. Good for you if you can do it all on fundraising. But at least in working with our bank, and I'll disclose that we banked with First Republic Bank. They, before giving us debt, they wanted to see a pretty significant component of fundraising and even some progress against that fundraising before finalizing the debt or determining the debt. The fundraising is usually launched around the design phase. I think for us, we had both a private and then a public phase. So that's fairly common. I think one of the lessons we learned is that, especially as we progressed during our fundraising, that at the beginning we had pledges that maybe lasted 3-4 years. Like someone said, okay, we're going to give you 100,000 and it's going to be 25, 25, 25, 25. I think as it progressed, our fundraising progressed, one of the things that I think our advancement department learned is that it's harder to do. We shouldn't really do those longer tailed pledge terms of 3 or 4 years, because then we'll be collecting pledges long after the building is finished. So that was one of the things that we learned. So maybe early on go with some longer tails, and then later in the project go through some shorter tails. Because right now our construction is well over, it's 2 years, 22 months completed, and now I'm still collecting on pledges for that construction. So something we learned. There's two different types of debt. There's tax exempt debt and then just regular, taxable debt. I think you have to figure out what's right for you. We decided to do tax exempt debt. For tax exempt debt, you usually can get a lower interest rate, but it also has higher fees up front because it's more costly debt, and it's going to involve a third party, because tax exempt debt means you're really going through not only First Republic Bank, but we went through a other not-for-profit authority in order to qualify for tax exempt. So taxable, less fees, maybe a little bit higher interest. In addition to the long-term debt, your 25 or 30-year debt, often what you'll see is in our case, we called it Series A and Series B. There's a Series B piece that is structured like a line of credit that allows you to fund higher your construction costs, which are going to peak before you might have collected all your pledges from your fundraising campaign. So that's another way to help bridge the slight mismatch between costs incurred and fundraising income coming in. What are some of the other lessons that I've learned is that we went through an RFP process, or whatever you want to call it. So, and we got 3 different banks proposals, and I just think there's some banks that just have a lot better experience. One working with construction debt, but two, working with a lot of schools. And so that was important to us to find a lender who really knew the ins and outs of schools' finances. What was key for us as well, and I can't remember if Dave mentioned in the previous slide in legal, is that you really need to hire two separate attorneys. Obviously, Dave really mentioned the key, having an excellent construction attorney. That's a very different attorney than the attorney that's helping you with the debt and loan agreements. And so we specifically hired an attorney that not only was deep in loan agreements, but also, because we did tax exempt debt, but very knowledgeable about tax exempt debt, which is very unique if you haven't done it before. So that was very helpful for us. I think for some schools, depending on where you are in your finance and legal area, is just making sure that you have all the supporting documents, et cetera, for the debt if you haven't gotten debt before. I mean, some of you who've been through it have already been through the concept of the war room and having all the information available. The other key thing, again, I come from corporate, so some of this was very different for me, is that the bank really was very particular about how much fundraising, I think I might have mentioned this before, how much fundraising they really wanted to see, how much fundraising and then cash from that fundraising that you've incurred, so that for them, they wanted a certain percentage of skin in the game from the school before starting to draw down on the funds for the debt. Okay, so how about budgeting? So on the budgeting, Dave mentioned a lot of great points. For us, again, it was critical getting a very knowledgeable owner's rep who can actually work with the architects early on, and then when the general contractor comes in, helping to articulate and work with the various parties to come up with realistic budgets. I think for us, we ended up changing general contractors before we even started construction, when we were in the pre-construction phase. And I think one of the main reasons we did that is because we were not getting as good of budget information as we had wanted. And so the architect will come up with some general ideas, the construction, the GC will help validate that budget. And then of course, as Dave said, you're working on your contingencies and adding in the school funded costs. And I'll get to that in a minute, but it's very critical that all the players, that you have good enough players at the beginning to to be able to come up with at least a decent range for that budget. I think we had such a difference in the budget from the design phase, from the actual pre-construction phase. I mean, it almost doubled, and that's just too large of a change to be able to support to the board. We had even considered, before we changed our GCs, that we had actually considered hiring yet another consultant that Dave mentioned, because there's a lot of people that can help out along this process. We had actually considered getting a consultant whose job purely it was to come in and help create, along with the GC and the architect, a better budget. The other thing, so instead of doing that, we looked at that. Instead, what we did is when we hired, or we went out to bid again midstream for new GC, we ended up paying some additional costs in pre-construction costs above and beyond the cost of the contract to do a deeper dive for the budget with our GC. So that's how we handled it. But for us personally, that was one of our larger lessons learned, is I don't think we had invested early enough in the right talent to develop an adequate budget So that was my first bullet. I can't emphasize enough to actually to make sure that you're setting aside enough of a contingency. We set aside a full 10%. When we did construction, it decided to rain, 60 days solid. There's so many things that can happen. I call it discovering the Indian burial ground underneath once you start digging. So I just think it's very critical. Items always come up. I think it's important to make sure that you have the right people looking at the change order process. I think we set a dollar amount where myself, the owner's rep, and then the GC, we approved certain change orders up to a certain dollar amount. And then we had another group of people. It was the head of school and then the head of the facilities committee and myself, who could then look at another dollar amount. And again, it was a smaller group, but it was just so you could make decisions fairly quickly, because some of these change orders are very time sensitive. So if you look at the cost, they're really in sort of two buckets: the hard costs and the soft costs. The hard costs being a lot of the construction related costs and the associated permits, et cetera, that go with that. The other soft costs that are most likely going to fall to the school to estimate is, for instance, if you're creating a brand new building, how are you going to furnish it? All your furniture and fixtures. Dave mentioned audio visual. That might be something that you want to do or control from the school's perspective. You might have some AV people that you love, and so you would rather manage that. And then you have more of a business decision on that. So I think so don't forget about all those moving costs. There's a lot of soft costs that it's important that you don't forget, because the GC isn't going to think about those costs. You are. For us, another also big soft cost for us is that we're a boarding school. So we had to figure out how to feed people for a year without a dining hall. So that was another example of a soft cost for us. Internal reporting, same old, over communicate with your board, with your smaller group, for us, we had a facilities committee. So a lot of picking up the phone and talking with them we The other thing I just want to throw out, because it was, again, just something I learned, is that we had a 3-year construction project, just make sure that at the end of each of those fiscal years, just make sure that you're accruing for the retention, even though you haven't been billed for it. So just a little slight note that I had forgotten to do that the first time and had to add that. So, don't forget to accrue. Yeah, I think the only other thing, I want to go backwards a few points, is that one of the things that was key for us when we, going back to the budgeting topic, is value engineering. Dave alluded to that when he talked about the pre-construction phase, or you can do value engineering anytime in the beginning process. But for us, once we hired that second GC, and the GC that did an excellent job for us, and during that pre-construction phase, when they were coming up with the budget, it still was too high. And at that point, that value engineering process, extremely critical, extremely tough, extremely emotional. And of course, you're making trade-offs on a lot of nice to haves. But that was also a significant component of making sure that we met our budget. And I'd like to tell you, throughout that whole process, that the budget, and we spent every single dime of our 10%, not almost 1 cent over. We were within $100,000 of that 24 million. So that phase was so critical for us, and that value engineering was extremely critical for us. Okay, so we're open to questions. If folks want to unmute, or we could try it through chat, but why don't we just see if just asking questions works.
Hey, Leslie, this is Steve Achek from Chinese American. Just curious, when you're saying the banks were requiring a look at the fundraising. Obviously, this would just be, you know, an upfront. This is before the long-term perspective loan financing. Could this been the short term? Was this any financing? Or were they even requiring something in covenants or something like that during the, you know, the after the loan had closed and going forward?
Oh gosh, that last is a good question. No, they didn't have specific requirements after we signed the debt, but during the debt negotiations and of course the detailed forecasting or sources and uses as they like to call it, is that we needed to show how much fundraising we had to date, what our goals were on the fundraising, and then also a cash projection on when those sources of cash would come in. So we had showed significant progress on that to date, and it also helped us then negotiate the terms and the amount of that letter of credit, right? I'm not sure.
So this is Dave. So Steve, is your question around like the line of credit and like what happens during like after the loan is closed but before the construction project is done?
It was through any, it was more of a general, just through any of the stages. If it was part of the original RFP process, whether the banks came back and asked for it, or whether they needed something before you did a construction loan or when you got into your long-term financing. So at any point of those stages, was more curious whether they required it, or even after the closing was anything put into the document. So.
Okay, so I can also maybe add a little bit to that, because I actually have an open line of credit now, and we ran into a problem because the line of credit, usually they have an end date for when the line of credit's open, and when they convert it from a line of credit to actual, you know, just like a regular loan, it gets really complicated. But I can say that on our project, the bank actually hired a third party that's monitoring your construction project, which is pretty common. And then what they're doing is they're just kind of like, it's a compliance thing where they're looking to make sure that if you say it's 80% done and you've given it, you know, you've given receipts for 80%, things like that, they have a third party that's actually validating that, and they're taking photos, and, you know, it costs you a couple $1,000s a month. And then they go through and they'll do that. But there's like, through the whole process, there is a lot of compliance, I will say, on the bank. And the last thing they want to have is they want to have an open loan to a school and their problems. And so they're definitely, you know, watching it. And then at the end, there are a number of documents that you need to actually submit, your substantial completion. These are all signed documents to close out the loan and actually officially convert it from an open, you know, line of credit to just basically a typical senior, you know, senior loan. And that's something where, and if any of you have questions on that, I think Leslie and I will give our email out later. Those can be very specific to your school. We're happy to share our experiences with that and kind of go into more detail depending on your needs.
So there was a couple questions on the chat. One of it was about the background of the owner's rep. Again, that's a critical player. Our owner's rep had some they didn't come from the construction industry. The construction rep, or the owner's rep we hired, came from what I'd call facilities management, and had probably 25 years of construction in both private and public schools. So I think it isn't necessarily to come from construction, but they're very experienced in being an owner's rep. And again, this gentleman had deep facilities knowledge. We also interviewed a gal who probably was even less stronger from a construction or facilities, but very strong from a project management perspective. So that was her background. And again, we liked her as well. I don't know about Dave.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's totally accurate. We've had similar experiences, and just to add to that, it depends on your makeup. So at our school, we have a board member who's very strong in construction, and so he will help on kind of the major issues to make sure that we're, you know, basically the school's treated fairly if there's a major dispute or issue in construction. So our owner's rep is more focused on documentation. And so I think she's exceptional at project management, documentation, meetings, moving things along. I did interview a different person who was probably not as good on the documentation, but much better about construction. And he used to be a general contractor, and he got out of the business, and now he's just working with schools and with other, as an owner's rep. That's his title, but he's much more focused on construction, and he'll dig in on the details to challenge the contractor on the way that their method and means, the way that they're actually approaching a specific solution to make sure that that's the cheapest high quality solution from the school's perspective. So there's kind of a range of owner's reps that you can have. And again, if you want recommendations, if you send us an email, we can, both Leslie and I can share our experiences, and at least in the Bay Area. If you guys are up here, we're happy to share, more details about that.
There were a couple of other questions on the group chat. Usually you hire your architect first, and then depending, for us, remember, we changed GCs, and before I started, we hired the architect, and then we hired a GC. I think before we got the owner's rep, I would probably insert the owner's rep in between, but Dave has more experience than I do. Actually, we got referrals for owner's rep from other schools, from our facilities outsource company, and from the actual GCs. So schools, GCs, and then the facilities group. I don't think we got any referrals from our architect, but Dave that might be different for Dave.
Yeah, I think like you said, we hired our architect first, and then we had references. We had a couple of references from our architect for owners reps, and then we also had board members who had experience in construction. They knew people, so I think those are good. I would caution about having an owners rep from a GC, because like I said, GCs are motivated by cash and profit, and so sometimes there are it is a game where you got to you get into a dispute, and even if it's not a legal dispute, it's just an argument. And you need to have a strong owner's rep who's representing the school, and doing so in unfortunately a pretty hard stance on certain issues against the general contractor. But we hired the architect first. We had a owner's rep who worked well with the architect. That worked out splendid. And I think that, and then sometimes I would say our GC did not necessarily love our owner's rep, but that's actually not a bad thing when that happens.
Yeah.
David and Leslie, are you using owner's rep interchangeably with project manager? Like, we've interviewed a couple, we're looking at doing sort of a mid-sized project, and we're interviewing a couple of project managers, and they encourage us to hire them. Of course, they want us to encourage that before the architect, so they could help select an architect that fit our project. So I guess and I don't want to get too down in the weeds here, but if you could just talk about that briefly.
I think we are. I mean, what is critical is that you hire someone, or I guess you could hire a firm, but someone who has your best interest at heart. And listen, if you want them also to help hire an architect, you certainly can hire them at that time. But yes, I think we are. It's just the person who's experienced enough with construction that can go be the bulldog, excuse the expression, with the GCs, but and also keep you extremely informed, and to Dave's point, all the paperwork flowing, because it's massive.
Yep. Yeah, and I think I would say it's interchangeable, but there is like our owner's rep is, I would say, excellent at project management. Mm-hmm. And what she does, which I think is phenomenal, is she'll look ahead and say, at the end of the project, this is what you need to have, and work backwards to say, okay, based on that, and it takes 3 months with the city to file this paper, and I've done it 20 times, and these are the things that can happen, and oh yeah, if there is this issue, you got to be prepared with this, and then she'll say, this is what we need to do today, this week, and this month. And so I think that, I think project management, but I would say project management with construction, and ideally with projects that are similar to the one that you're thinking about, you know, and it can be new construction is very different than a renovation. So if you have to go into a building and then they open it up and you may find dry rot or something else that needs to be fixed, you know, having an owner's rep who's got experience with that as a project manager would be phenomenal. But I think the ideal owner's rep is the project management, but then also they understand they can fight with the contractor on an issue. Like, why are you, you know, they'll look at something and they're saying, well, why are you using, I don't know, you know, why are you doing it this way?
Yeah.
Why not these 3 other ways that cost the school less? They may be a little harder for you because you're using materials that, you know, it's not easy, you know, for you. It's a little extra time and there's more risk for the contractor, but it'll save the school $100,000. Why don't you do it that way? Those are like the bulldog that Leslie was saying. That's the kind of, you know, polite bulldog going in and challenging the contractor on how they're doing it.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was great.
So, other questions or maybe even topics areas that you want a little more detail on?
Great. Yeah. Like I said, we have our emails there if you wanted to email questions, or doesn't even, I mean, in next month, if you think of a question, feel free. So we'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Leslie.
Very helpful. Thank you so much.